When you see your expenses and you review each transaction, you really know what's happening in your account. So it's well worth the time, even though it can be time consuming and feel monotonous sometimes. Well, thank you very much. Excited to talk to you guys about this. I think expense tracking is such a critical part of planning, and it's the part of the equation that's easier to control. I mean, income can be controlled. You can go out and get another job, you can get promoted, but it takes time. There's a lot of lead time. Expense tracking and monitoring, changing your expenses is something that you can do. It's under your own control. Obviously, there's some expenses that are fixed, but there are many that aren't. So we've always found it extremely helpful. Yesterday, when I was kind of joking in the intro that Maggie sort of brought me into the fire world, she definitely did from like the content and learning about it, but I've definitely been the person that does a lot of the numbers at home, the expense tracking, the taxes, and so kind of excited to share some of that with you guys today. As you can see from our template, instead of using the CampFI template, I'm using Maggie's Inside Out Money podcast. Friends on Fire was her first podcast, but I'm using her template. I'm on her non-existent payroll, so using that template. That is from our wedding in Canada. So very special moment for us. And then kind of this just shows how a lot of our money tracking occurs. We're watching TV. This is actually me doing the taxes instead of expense tracking, but very similar process. We're watching TV, and then I'm pausing it every few minutes to ask Maggie a question of like, how do you want to categorize this? What do you want to do with this? Do we split this expense? So most people, especially in the business world, have heard this saying by Peter Drucker, what gets measured gets improved. It's short, concise, but it's true. You can't really improve something if you don't measure it regularly. For those of you who feel like this might be too concise, maybe lacking some context, we also have British mathematician Lord Kelvin, who perhaps was a little bit more verbose. And he said, I often say, and he probably said this in a very sophisticated British accent that I won't try to imitate, but what you can measure what you are speaking about and express it in numbers. You know something about it, but when you cannot measure it, when you cannot express it in numbers, your knowledge is of a meager and unsatisfactory kind. It may be the beginning of knowledge, but you've scarcely in your thoughts advanced to the stage of science, whatever the matter may be. So I kind of put that up there jokingly, but in a way it really has some like pretty salient points that if you really aren't monitoring, measuring your expenses, you really don't have a true knowledge of them. You might have a rough idea of how much you spend in a year, but if you were going to try to improve those finances, would you be able to do that if all you knew was that you spent X amount per year, but you weren't able to really break it down and understand, what you spent in different areas, and what of those are something you can change in the short term or the long term? So we always used Mint to do this tracking, as I think many people did. It's a free resource. It's been around for ages. It had some strong features, but it as Maggie often jokes, it felt like it was like stuck in the early 2000s. They really didn't do a lot to update it, but it was free. So we just kind of dealt with it, and said, okay, it's not perfect, but it works. And so when they announced last fall that they were going to be canceling it, and migrating to Money Rocket or Rocket Money, I think, Credit Karma. Thank you, Maggie. It was an opportunity to look and see what other opportunities were out there, and perhaps even pay a yearly fee for a program that works better. So we tried several of them. And I will say, I know there are probably fans of some of these others, so this wasn't a professional review we did. We just trialed all of them and chose the one that worked best for us. Monarch's a really great app. And we're not paid by them or anything. So this is just, we just use it personally. But it was developed by it was founded by someone that worked for Mint, who left and I think said, Mint's good, but we can make it better. And a subscription model would help us do that. So if you've ever used Mint, I think Monarch will feel very comfortable for you. So some basics of expense tracking. This is again, pretty remedial stuff, but I think it's important just to talk about it. One of the first things that I think is important is determine your groups and categories. And I think it's important to do that before you start running a bunch of expenses through, because they'll get auto-categorized, and your groups might be you might want to use the defaults, but as we've talked to people and kind of shared expenses, and on the Inside Out Money podcast, we do an episode every year where we have some of the other co-hosts and we talk about our expenses, and we all track them differently. And even when I hear someone say, well, I track it this way, and I think, well, that's not right. We do it the right way. Then they explain why they track it that way. And I go, oh, well, that is the right way for you. So there's no one right way to do it. And I'll give just a really quick example. For us, we have everything that is restaurant related going into a restaurant category, whether it's a coffee shop, whether it's takeout, or whether it's a really nice sit down meal. It's just in restaurants. We want to know how much money we're spending when we're not cooking our own food. Make the categories your own. Look back at your prior expenses and, maybe look at the default categories that are in there, but know that they're all customizable and you can make them, work for you so that you can best understand where your money's going. Optional is setting budgets for those categories. And I say that's optional because there are some people that really like to budget and set a budget and manage to that. Maggie and I don't do that. We've set budgets in a couple areas around restaurants just because it's a very easy thing to change. But even that, we don't really manage to it very aggressively. Some people do. So that's very optional. You don't have to be a budget setter to track your expenses. And I think that's a key thing too. Some people are maybe intimidated because they're thinking, well, I don't want to set a budget and manage to that. You don't have to do that. You don't have to start there. Maybe just track your expenses and see where you're spending your money. And that alone might, some light bulbs might turn on of places you can save money and change your consumption habits. Next is to review each transaction. And that's the most time-consuming piece of this. Once you get your categories set up and you walk through whatever program you're using and all your transactions flow through, is you have to sit down, you have to review each of them. You can set up rules for auto-categorizing, but even those may not work all the time. You may have your grocery store set to groceries because that's 90% of what you buy there. But we track things like toiletries separately. So if we end up buying toiletries at that grocery store, we're going to want to split that transaction, say $10 of that purchase was toiletries. But again, up to you. But that's probably the most time consuming piece for me, is going and reviewing those. And the other thing I would say is do it regularly. I've had periods of life where I kind of once a month will sit down at the end of the month and go through and categorize all these things. And it's just really time consuming. It makes for a pretty miserable evening because you're trying to remember something from a month ago and you're searching for your receipts. And the other thing is it's not actionable. If you're updating it weekly or every few days, you can kind of see real time if you're spending more in a certain category than you intended. And you can kind of then say, hey, for the next couple of weeks, let's not eat out, or let's cut back on this expense, as opposed to getting to the end of the month and saying like, wow, we just blew the budget and it's too late now. So I think it's something that's important to just kind of track. And that's what's nice about the app too, is you can do it anytime you just have some free time, and you can kind of nerd out and update your categories. Lastly is just analyzing your spending regularly. Look for those trends. We usually look monthly at our spending. As I said, we'll do some real-time stuff too if we look like we're over-indexing in a certain area. Now I'll talk a little bit about Monarch and kind of the process of setting it up. And so there's a few little things that I like to do even before I actually start having the transactions flow through. And I just did a few screenshots here. And just a couple key things. One is to go to settings and select the box to review all transactions. And that's something you can choose to do or not. But for me with Mint, the problem was always knowing what transactions I had reviewed and which ones I hadn't, because they come in sporadically. Some of them you just know off the top of your head, so you categorize. The other one you say, oh, I may need to wait till I'm at home and pull this receipt out and see what it was. So Monarch has a really nice queue for unreviewed transactions or transactions that need reviews. Another quick thing is toggling off showing investment transactions. And so you can actually load all kinds of accounts into Monarch. It's not just your bank account and your credit cards. You can load in your investment accounts. And what's pretty neat about that is if you do net worth tracking, which many of us I think do, It's a nice way to just go to one screen and see your whole net worth. You can load in your properties. You can load in your liabilities, such as your mortgages. So it'll show your, kind of your true net worth. It'll show all of your investment accounts. It even starts pulling information about how you're comparing to the market. So there's lots of cool stuff around investments. Another neat thing about Monarch is that you can add household members. So that's kind of a cool thing. Instead of just having a shared login, which works too, you can create 2 household members. And then when you set up reviews, that's also neat too, because you can say, send this to Maggie's review queue. So if there's certain expenses that I don't know what they are, I can add them to her queue. And then all she has to do is go in and filter on transactions that need her review, and then they're right there for her. These are the default, actually, these are not the default categories. Some of these are ours, but this is what it looks like when you go into categories and you update them. So it's pretty simple. You can't see all of them here. If after this, someone says, hey, I'm happy to share our categories via email if that would be helpful to people. But you can kind of see some of our categories in here, and they're by groups, which is kind of neat too. So another optional feature is tags. And this is something Mint had. It's something that I think Copilot didn't have. And so tags are very optional, but they're helpful for certain things. And I'll share why we use it. And as we've shared on the podcast a number of times, we have separate finances. And separate finances means that we, have our own separate accounts, but we have a lot of visibility into each other's spending. We spend together. We have a lot of shared expenses, for instance, utilities at the house, groceries. And so we use tagging as a way to really help us know if it's a shared expense or a personal expense of our own. So the next thing you want to do is you want to add accounts. As I said, you can add any kind of account. They link through Plaid for the most part, so it's really easy. But this is kind of the screen you would go to where you set up new accounts, and you can see there's several types of accounts there. You can add them in. Again, you go through Plaid, and it links and it pulls over all of your accounts. You can, if you have multiple accounts, you can choose to include some or not. The next thing that I think is important after you add all of your bank accounts and credit cards is adding a cash account. And so there's a way to do that. And that was a feature that Mint didn't have. And, there are times where we just have cash, and examples, we go to some of our kids' volleyball tournaments and they're cash only. And it's $20, not a big expense, but we still want to know we spent $20. And it's really nice to have these cash accounts. And so you just go in and you select that you're going to do a cash account. It will actually, and I think this is this is my fake cash account, my under the mattress account. You have to actually set a balance, which is kind of funny. I mean, some of you may actually have a stash of cash, and you may say, I have $1,000 of cash, and I actually want to track that and know when that's getting low, when I need to get more cash. So you can actually do that. I don't really have that. I just put an arbitrary amount, and now it says I'm negative 2,000 in cash because it's not, I just want to know more of the expense tracking. But if you actually manage cash at home, it could be a useful tool for that as well. So this is the transaction view. So this kind of gets to the point of you've set your accounts up, transactions are flowing through, you're getting a little insight into a very small snapshot of some of our expenses here. Very user-friendly interface. Specifically, this is what it looks like if you edit a transaction. So this is one of our transactions from Lidl. When you click on that right arrow next to the transaction, it brings you up to this screen. So it tells you the original statement name. So you can see here it was Apple Pay, Lidl, and a bunch of numbers. It does a pretty good job of renaming them for you. So you don't have to go into each one and say it's Lidl. So that's the basics of it. It's pretty straightforward. The other cool thing is splitting transactions. We do a lot of that. I've met people who say, that's too much work. Just put it in one category, whatever 90% of it is. I think it's whatever works for you. I'm a big fan of splitting transactions, though. I just think the more specific your information is, the more you can do something with it. So I just enjoy doing it. Once you do those splits and you hit the orange box that says split it, it'll now appear as 2 separate transactions. They're always linked. So if you click on one, you can always find its linking transaction, but they're separate as far as transactions. So you can categorize them separately. You can tag them separately. You can do whatever you want with them. So that's kind of nice and something we do a lot. The other thing we do a lot of is hiding transactions. That happens when you do refunds. We order things from Amazon and we return them. You can do two things in that situation. You can categorize the expense as whatever it is, say it's a grocery item. And then you can also, when you get the refund, you can say that's a grocery item as well. So you have the expense and the negative expense and they even out. We'll do that if it crosses months. Like if we bought it in January and we returned it in February, January's expenses are already done. We'll then show, okay, well in February we kind of have a credit. But if they happen together, sometimes it's better for me just to hide all of those. So rules are another neat thing, and many programs have rules. Mint had rules. What's cool about Monarch, and I'm sure some of the other more contemporary programs have this as well, is that this is almost like a if this, then this statement in that there's multiple inputs and multiple outputs, which is really pretty cool. And my experience with Mint is it's more just, based on, I think, the merchant. And then if the merchant's this, then categorize it this way. But what's so cool is you can hopefully see here is that there's multiple inputs. You can look at the merchant name. You can say whether it matches exactly, or if you're getting weird like Apple Pay in numbers, you can say just if it contains some of this word, categorize it this way. I found those rules pretty helpful, and I still review some of them. But even if you have to review it, it may save you 5 clicks. And if you're reviewing 300 categories or 300 transactions, that can still save you a lot of time and a lot of clicks. So the rules are really cool. They're very customizable. We've been very happy with them. So I wanted to point that out too as just a nice little feature. So getting to review spending, there's many ways you can review spending. There's a number of things in here. There's a cash flow statement. There's a budget. There's it actually uses your past to budget out using your past. It'll kind of show what they think your expenses will be. So there's a lot of tools in here, but this is the simple view that we look at the most. You just go into the cash flow section and then go down to expenses, and it shows you your expenses either by category, by group, or by merchant. So if your categories, you're more specific, and then your group would be kind of your totaled up. So for instance, like for us, groceries, restaurants, and alcohol and bars all go into the food category. So this is the most granular view, but you can see here that we, spent our every 6-month auto insurance came up in February. So that was our base expense. Groceries, we spent $986, which is really a high month for us. So we got to look at that. Travel accommodations. And you can kind of go down, and what you can't see here is you can easily see your total expenses for the month as well. But this just kind of shows you graphically. You can toggle over to group. Sometimes I start at group and say which group looks high. And then when you click on the specific group, it'll then drill down into the subcategories of the group. But it's just a really nice view for this. Budgets are also something that's pretty neat. It will set budgets for you. If you don't even go in and set budgets, once it has a month or two of data, it will actually kind of set a budget for you. So these are the few categories we actually have. And I say budgets, we don't really manage to these very specifically, but we do have some numbers that we generally try to look at. So you can see here our total food and dining, our budget's $1,000, $600 for groceries, $350 for restaurants, and $50 for alcohol and bars. And then you can kind of see what your actual is for the month. What's pretty neat too is if you said, well, that $600 for groceries just isn't right, you would just click on that box, and then it quickly allows you to change it. And it's pretty neat too because it shows a 3-month trend. So that's really nice too. I mean, you can do more specific work and go back and look at a 12-month trend, but it's really neat that just right at your fingertips, you click on that box and it brings up your most recent 3 months. So it kind of just makes it easier if you're tweaking your budgets to kind of do everything from one screen. So this is a nice view, and it's one that you can easily see from your phone. So if you update your expenses regularly and you are saying, oh, should we go out and, I see this shirt that I really want, should I buy it? You can look at your clothing budget if you track that and say, well, I'm already over budget for the month, I'll have to wait till next month or whatever. It may keep you from making impulse decisions. So that's really it on Monarch, and I'm happy to answer some specific questions on that as we finish up. I know that's not a walkthrough on everything, but I wanted to hit the most salient features that I think will help someone new setting up, and especially because some of those are things that they're better to do on the front end than to get a bunch of data and then on the back end try to kind of retrofit things. But overall, I wanted to just kind of recap expense tracking in general, and why I think it's so critical, starting from the more tactical to the little bit more kind of lofty things. I mean, one thing that's just important about it is we frequently spot errors, things that we got charged for something and we didn't expect it. We did some subscription that we canceled, somehow we got charged for. It's just, some erroneous charge. I mean, it's amazing the stuff you catch when you're looking at your money regularly. So that's just a really key tactical thing of when you see your expenses and you review each transaction, you really know what's happening in your account. So it's well worth the time, even though it can be time consuming and feel monotonous sometimes. I think regularly reviewing expenses and talking about them really increases our communication around money. And it's, again, so interesting with Maggie and I having separate finances. I think though we have technically separate finances, we have very high level of communication around expenses and awareness of where they're going. And a lot of that comes through these regular things. Again, some of it is in just me saying, hey, what was this expense? What was that? And then at the end of the month saying, or even weekly, kind of saying, hey, here's where we are on spending on this. And it just allows for great conversations, and I think will increase communications within a household. I think we've been able to reduce our spending greatly. Over the past few years, we've kind of been at a plateau, but when we first really started looking at this, it really helped. It helped to know at a macro level what we were spending annually. I think if you want to get to retirement, you need to know that, because especially when you start getting to that, as someone mentioned, the drawdown phase, when there's maybe some money coming in, some passive income, but it's not what was coming in when you were working. Controlling your expenses is the thing that will give you the feeling of control of my money can last. Because otherwise, it's easy to start having this fear of, is my money going to last? But when you know what you're spending every year and you can make that reliable, it is very reassuring. Another thing I will say too is that every year there's one or two big unexpected expenses. One year it was medical for us. I got LASIK. There was something with one of the kids getting braces. But even despite those big expenses, we found that one replaces another. So our annual expenses stay pretty consistent. Those unusual expenses come and go. But overall, we've been pretty consistent in our total spend. And then knowing what you're spending by category, again, it really does help you find those areas that you can tighten your belt a little. And again, you really can't do that unless you know what you're spending. And sometimes it's very eye-opening. Another thing I would say is share this with a friend. If you, especially in this community, the idea of sharing expenses to me was kind of felt very personal and I didn't like it. But Maggie's first podcast, Friends on Fire, we started doing that with her co-host at the time, Mike. He was a very frugal person, and I felt attacked at first by him when he was like, how could you spend that? I mean, he's a very blunt person. So I was like, I can't believe we're doing this, Maggie. Why would we do this? But it really changed my perception on things, and it really made us tighten our belts. And I was really glad we did it at the end of it. So have those conversations with a trusted friend, especially in this space. It's really amazing, and people will give you lots of ideas of how you can save money, but you can't engage in those conversations as much if you don't know where your money's going. So again, it's so worth the time. And I think I've already sort of made this last point. We really know what we're spending, and it gives us a lot of comfort on knowing that our money that's saved will last. I mean, that's anyone who's done that 4% rule. That's what you have to know your annual expenses. And I think when I talk to people not in the fire community, they say, well, it just feels so overwhelming. How would you ever know what you need, especially this early in life? And you say, well, if you know what it costs you to live, you can figure it out. I mean, again, there's variables you don't know. But if you know what you spend, you can really forecast a lot in the future. But if you have no idea, it really is a shot in the dark. So it's worth the time. I find it to be very helpful, and hopefully this is a helpful start for some of you guys that aren't doing this. But any questions? Oh, thank you.